Welcome back. One of President Obama's closest aides is out with a new book telling a behind-the-scenes story of the administration from start to finish. Ben Rhodes was a speechwriter during the 2008 Obama campaign. After the election, he became Deputy National Security Advisor. Rhodes was so close with the president that the two were often said to have a mind meld. His new book, The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House, takes you through some of the most pivotal moments of the presidency with stories from inside the room. Earlier, my colleague Elaine Quijano sat down with Ben, who is also the brother of CBS News President David Rhodes, to talk about how he helped shape American foreign policy.
Let's take a step back for a moment. Before you joined the Obama administration, you were an aspiring novelist. And outside of your work in the White House, one of your lasting legacies will be the addition of a new term to the D.C. lexicon. Yeah. Explain for us what the Blob is and how it affected your time in the White House.
Well, I was, one of the things that was interesting about my perspective is that, I didn't come in through the traditional pathway. I spent several years working in foreign policy, involved in the 9/11 Commission, the Iraq Study Group, but I hadn't kind of saturated in that world. And I also was upset about the Iraq War. I saw an Obama guy who called it right, and I saw a lot of people in Washington who called it wrong. And over the course of the 8 years, what I came to see is that there's this reflex in Washington foreign policy circles often to say, there's a problem, we have to solve it, and the way to solve it is using our military, especially in the Middle East. And when I said the Blob, what I was referring to is kind of a groupthink, that the way in which we solve a problem is by bombing a country, and that if we're not engaging militarily in the Middle East, then we're not credible. And, I saw that we weren't learning lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq. We were in a risk of just repeating the same mistake over and over again. And so, to me, that proved to be a controversial comment, just like it was controversial when President Obama said, don't do stupid stuff. But in fact, all we're trying to say is, there needs to be some reckoning with the fact that, we should draw from Iraq and Afghanistan the lesson that our ability to shape events inside of countries in the Middle East is limited. We can blow things up, we can take out terrorists, the military is the best in the history of the world, but that doesn't mean that you can engineer the politics of another country.
Another controversial comment was when you talked about creating a quote-unquote echo chamber among inexperienced Washington journalists to help sell the Iran deal to the U.S. And critics, as you well know, have focused on that line to insist that you were manipulating public opinion to push the deal along. Do you think that that helped contribute to its ultimate downfall?
Well, no. Look, first of all I was saying was providing, I was explaining to a reporter how we communicated the Iran deal. I did not, he's the one who kind of turned that into me manipulating people. The basic things I was talking about doing are the routine work of any White House. You have people in, you brief them, you hope that they carry your message out. I mean, it's actually not as diabolical as it was portrayed and followed up ever since. In fact, there's a very healthy echo chamber that opposed the Iran deal over the course of the last several years. No, I think that the reason there's not an Iran deal now has nothing to do with that. It has to do with basically Donald Trump's hostility to anything Barack Obama did, because when he came in to office, the Iran deal was working, Iran was complying. His Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, wanted to keep it in place. His former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, wanted to keep it in place. They kind of went searching for rationale to blow it up, and ultimately didn't even really find one. So I attribute his decision on the Iran deal entirely to his hostility to things that were associated with Obama's legacy.
In the book, you write about the early days of the Arab Spring, and specifically a disconnect that seemed to be sort of a generational divide between the older members of the cabinet, including Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Defense Secretary Bob Gates, and then the younger members of the administration, including yourself, as well as the president. But how did that generational divide affect U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think it manifested itself, in those early days of the Arab Spring. You had people like Secretary Gates, who had been invested for decades in this relationship with Mubarak. One of the most interesting comments President Obama made to me in the height of that, after calling President Mubarak and suggesting that he step down, and really kind of, breaking that relationship, is, he said, well, I have a really close personal relationship with King Abdullah of Jordan. I'm not sure I could have done that with him. And it was a very human thing. It was, to go back to Joe Biden's comment, personal relationships. So part of this was just generational, that they had relationships that he didn't have. I think generationally, where that manifested itself more broadly is we broke certain taboos. The Cuba policy change. Some of that was just, the reason we had an embargo and didn't have relations with Cuba is because that's how it always been done. And it took kind of a generational view to say, well, let's try something different, And so to me, where I think that was helpful was on things like Cuba, or Iran for that matter, where trying something different and being less wedded to the way things have been done in the past was helpful. While at the same time, there's a lot of consistency. I look at Trump. That's a much more dramatic break from the past. So we had consistency on a lot of issues, but on some issues we said, well, if it hasn't been working this way, let's try it a different way.
Let me ask you about Afghanistan. You also wrote about the push to, quote, act like we're going to win the war in Afghanistan. And there are, of course, troops still there today. Do you ever feel like there was a push for the U.S. to take military action just for the sake of looking as though the United States was being proactive and continuing to be a presence there in Afghanistan?
I do. And I feel like that's a real danger, that we had a narrow objective. That President Obama, we went this whole Afghan review, and he kept saying, "Look, we're not going to make Afghanistan a perfect place. We're not even going to defeat the Taliban. The Taliban, they're people who live there. They're tribal affiliations. Our goal is to defeat Al Qaeda, and there's a counterterrorism mission. But there was kind of a mission creep associated with the military because they're there and they're fighting an insurgency, and they want to defeat that insurgency." And then it becomes an issue of credibility for the president. Well, will you or will you not put these troops in? Frankly, I think we should be out of Afghanistan. When I look back at our administration, I regret that we weren't able to bring that to a conclusion. Not because it would have been a perfect place, but because we're there. It's 2018. We've been there for more than 15 years. When is this going to end? What are we trying to accomplish? Are we making it better? Our troops are serving heroically, but what is the mission that we're giving them? And it troubles me that it's even kind of possible that we find ourselves in this position. That by the end of the Trump administration, if it's only one term, still it'll be almost 20 years in this war. That's not a healthy thing, I think, for a democracy.
To people who would push back on that and say, but to withdraw would mean to cede that ground back to terrorists who could then use Afghanistan once again to launch attacks against the United States.
And I think that what we found is if there's a terrorist safe haven, we can take it out. That you don't need to occupy a country in order to have intelligence and take out a terrorist safe haven. And instead, I think we take on a bigger mission. Well, we need to eradicate the Taliban, or we need to stay until the Afghan government has achieved a certain level of stability. When in fact, we might not be helping bring that outcome about. Our presence, in some way, may be attracting insurgents, and our presence may be preventing the Afghan government from actually standing up on its own. And so I worry it's always framed as, if we leave, this bad thing will happen, when in fact, we're staying and those bad things are happening anyway. And that's where I think you get into this kind of endless, open-ended type of war.
When you look back in your experience in the White House, where did American military intervention make life better for civilians on the ground?
Well, as I described, some of the most thrilling moments were around our counterterrorism missions, including taking out bin Laden. And, I think when I was there and we got the news that bin Laden had been taken out, I remember walking outside of the White House and just thinking that this is this awesome moment of justice for the families. I think that made life better, frankly, for victims of terrorism, not just of 9/11, but around the world, to know that justice can be done to a terrorist like that. There are certain instances where we intervened and saved lives. I think in Libya we did. However, the situation in Libya did not markedly improve. And to get at, I think, what is informing your question, again, we can take people out, and we can stop an advancing army like we did on the outskirts of Benghazi in Libya, or like we did in Iraq to save people from being eradicated. But what we're less capable of doing militarily is building up what comes after that. And that's not a negative comment on our military. It's just that's not what our military is designed to do. They're designed to fight and defeat adversaries. And the thing that is going to make life better for civilians is diplomacy, and it is foreign assistance and things that don't always capture the headlines.
One last question, and this is something that Gayle King mentioned on CBS this morning, but this book, as well as talking about the very weighty geopolitical matters for which you were in the room when these discussions were taking place, is also a very personal account of what your own experience, just as a human being in the world, it seemed, was trying to help navigate the tension between the personal obligations of having a wife and then the professional obligations of serving the President of the United States. And at one point you wrote this was right after the chemical attack outside Damascus, Syria. You talked in very personal terms about having to tell Anne, your wife, that you were going to have to leave to go back to Washington to meet regarding the Syria issue. You said, I asked McDonough if it was possible for, tell us who McDonough is.
Dennis McDonough, who was the White House Chief of Staff.
So you said, I asked McDonough if it was possible for Obama to call so he could talk to Anne, something he occasionally did for people who have grown weary of their spouse's work schedule. Instead, I got a short email from Obama telling me to come home as soon as possible. He said, I felt the loneliness of knowing that I'd have to do what the President of the United States was asking me to do, and that on the scale of what was going wrong in the world, my own inconvenience, however dramatic in the context of my family, was not going to be anyone else's concern. Why did you want to include that in the book?
Well, part of what I think I could offer somebody is that who's reading this book is that when I came into this job, I was nobody. I wasn't John Kerry or Hillary Clinton. I had kind of a life that you could recognize, and all of us have our own stories, and then there's the story of what's happening in the world. And what I wanted to convey to people is like, your own story doesn't go away just because you're in these jobs. In that particular case, what's so wrenching is like there was a very difficult time for my family because her father had passed away from cancer a year earlier. And so this was the first time we'd been together with her family since then on a vacation, and we were going to go visit his grave on the anniversary of his death, which in your own story, your own family, was an enormous event. But then when that's stacked up against, over 1,000 Syrians being gassed to death, I mean, obviously having to cut that short and fly back, as I say, pales in comparison. Nobody's going to feel sorry for me. But that doesn't make it any easier to tell your wife, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to go visit your father's grave on the first anniversary of his death, and see what that does to her, and to know all the missed moments that come with government service. So I just hope it pulls back a curtain for people on the fact that the people in these jobs are human beings, and they've got their own stories that are happening simultaneous to the story that we're all watching play out on the news every day.
Ben Rhodes, you've been really generous with your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.